Walter Briggs didn't say goodbye. He didn't even slow the wagon down. He pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of the tree line, reached back, and shoved the travel bag off the seat. It hit the frozen ground and split open. A dress spilled out into the snow, the only good one she owned. Then he looked at Clara, looked at the baby bundled against her chest, and said the words she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. "You're both useless to me." He clicked his tongue at the horse and left. The wagon wheels carved 2 dark lines through the snow and then disappeared around the bend, and Clara stood there holding a 6-month-old boy who didn't understand what cold was yet, only that he was in it, and that the woman holding him had started shaking in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She was 24 years old. She had traveled 11 days by rail and 2 more by wagon to reach this valley. She had written careful letters for 6 months. She had believed every word. Now there was nothing in front of her but trees and wind and a sky the color of an old bruise. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been left somewhere you didn't choose, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what happened to Clara didn't start in that snowstorm. It started long before Walter Briggs ever put pen to paper and wrote her a promise he never intended to keep. The letter had arrived in September, when the maples outside the Whitmore boarding house in Concord, New Hampshire were just beginning to turn. Clara had read it 3 times standing in the hallway, her landlady's footsteps creaking above her, the smell of boiled potatoes coming from the kitchen down the hall. The letter was written in a firm, slanted hand. Walter Briggs, rancher, Harlan County, Wyoming Territory. Age 41. Owns 260 acres, a working herd, and a 4-room house. Seeks a woman of steady character and practical disposition for the purpose of marriage and partnership in building a home on the frontier. Is not looking for beauty or romance. Is looking for someone capable and willing. Clara had folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron. She was not a romantic. She had learned to stop being one around the age of 17 when her father died and left the family nothing but debts and a rented house the bank collected inside of a month. She had spent the years since working, in laundries, in a dry goods store, as a seamstress's assistant when the work was available. She was not unhappy exactly. She was tired in the particular way that comes from doing the right thing every day without anyone noticing. When she wrote back to Walter Briggs, she was honest. She told him she was 23, that she was in good health, that she knew how to cook and clean and manage a household budget. She also told him something she suspected might end the correspondence right there, that she had a child, a boy, 4 months old, born to a man who had not stayed to meet him. She did not explain further. She said only that the boy was hers, that she would not leave him behind, and that if this was a problem, she understood completely. Walter wrote back in 6 days. He said the child was not a problem. He said he appreciated her honesty. He said he had been alone on the ranch for 3 years and that what he needed was someone steady. Clara read that letter 4 times. She had a trunk packed within the week. The train journey west was not what the illustrated magazines made it look like. There was no grand scenery rolling by the window, or rather there was, but Clara was too busy managing a hungry infant in a crowded car to appreciate it. The baby, she had named him Noah after her grandfather, did not sleep well on trains. He cried at the whistle and fussed at the stops and charmed exactly 2 other passengers, an older woman from Ohio and a German-speaking farmer who made ridiculous faces at him across the aisle until Noah laughed. Clara held him and fed him and changed him in the cramped washroom and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something she was almost afraid to call hope. She had not let herself want things for a long time. Wanting had a way of making the disappointments sharper. But somewhere past St. Louis, watching the landscape flatten and broaden into something vast and unfamiliar, she allowed herself a small thought. Maybe this one works out. Walter met her at the rail station in Cheyenne. He was taller than she'd imagined, with a dark beard that was starting to go gray at the edges, and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. He took her trunk without being asked. He shook her hand, glanced at Noah with an expression she couldn't quite read, and said, "Long ride ahead. You eat?" She had. He nodded and led her to the wagon. They drove for most of a day and into the evening. Walter was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, and at first Clara took that for seriousness, for depth. She filled the silences herself, pointing out things she saw, asking careful questions about the ranch. He answered in short sentences. Mostly he watched the road. She told herself, he's shy. He's not used to company. That's fine. She wasn't looking for a conversationalist. But somewhere around the fourth hour of driving, when Noah began to cry and she shifted to settle him, Walter looked over at the baby and said, "He do that a lot?" "He's hungry," Clara said. "It's been a few hours." Walter looked back at the road. "Right." Nothing in the word itself, but something underneath it, a flatness she couldn't name yet. She fed Noah and he quieted, and Walter said nothing more, and Clara watched the mountains in the distance and told herself she was imagining things. Touch 8. The ranch was real at least. 4 rooms, as promised, though they hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than Walter admitted. A working kitchen, a barn that needed repair in one corner, a yard that was well kept in the way of a man who cared about the land and not much else. There were cattle in the south pasture and 2 horses in the paddock and a dog named Hitch, who regarded Clara with deep suspicion before eventually deciding she was acceptable. The first 2 weeks were hard but not impossible. Clara found her footing in the kitchen, learned the rhythms of the household, figured out which floorboards creaked and which cabinet hinges needed oil. Walter came in for meals and went back out. He was not cruel. He was not warm. He was simply there. And Clara worked around him the way you work around a piece of heavy furniture. Noah was the problem. Not to Clara. Never to Clara. But she watched Walter's face when the baby cried in the night, and she saw what was growing there. Not anger, exactly. Something more like resentment. Something that said, "This is not what I signed up for." She tried to keep Noah quiet. She tried to time the crying for moments when Walter was outside. She told herself it would get easier as the baby grew. Infants were hard. Everyone knew that. Walter would come around. She was wrong. The shift happened at the end of the second week, on a Thursday evening when the temperature had dropped fast and the wind was picking up outside. Clara was putting Noah down in the back room when she overheard Walter talking to his neighbor, a man named Doyle, who had come by to return a borrowed tool. She wasn't trying to listen. The walls were thin. "She got a kid," Doyle said. "She told me up front," Walter said. "And?" A pause, long enough that Clara stopped breathing. "Ain't what I pictured." "The woman or the kid?" "Either." Another pause. Then, "Turns out she can't have more. Some kind of trouble with it. Doctor in Concord told her before she left. She didn't think to mention that." Clara stood very still in the back room with Noah asleep against her shoulder. She had mentioned it in a letter she'd sent in October. She had used careful, plain words. She had said she had been told by a physician that bearing more children might be difficult, possibly not possible. She had said she thought he should know before they made any final decisions. Walter had not written back about it. He had simply sent the train money. She had assumed that meant he understood, that it didn't change anything. Standing in that back room, she understood that she had assumed wrong. The next few days were different in a way she couldn't precisely point to. Walter did not raise his voice. He didn't say anything directly. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the house, the way a storm shifts the pressure before it arrives. He was quieter than usual at meals. He stopped asking about the ranch work she'd been helping with. He looked through her more than at her. Clara tried. She worked harder. She made meals she knew were better than she usually managed. She kept Noah as quiet as possible. She told herself, this is just adjustment. This is just 2 people figuring out how to exist in the same space. But one morning she came into the kitchen to find Walter reading one of her letters. Not a letter from him, but a letter she had written to her sister back east that she hadn't sent yet, sitting open on the table. He didn't look up when she came in. "You told your sister I'm difficult," he said. The letter didn't say that. The letter said the adjustment was taking longer than she'd hoped, and that Walter was a private man and that she was being patient. She had not complained. She had been very careful not to complain. "That's not what I wrote," she said. "I read it." "I know, I can see that." She kept her voice level. "What I wrote was that we're still getting to know each other." He looked up then. His eyes were flat in a way she hadn't seen before. You planning to stay? The question caught her off guard. Yes, that was the agreement. Agreements change. She didn't know what to say to that. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and Noah made a small sound from the back room, and Walter looked toward it with an expression she would not let herself interpret, because if she interpreted it correctly, she wasn't sure what she would do. "I'll start breakfast," she said. He got up from the table and went outside without answering. Chat. The morning he left them was a Wednesday. Clara knew it was a Wednesday because she had been counting the days without really meaning to, the way you count things when you're waiting for something to change. He told her at breakfast that he was driving into town for supplies. She asked if she should make a list, and he said it wasn't necessary. She asked if he'd be back by supper, and he said probably. His voice was the same as always, flat, measured, uninflected. She had no reason to think anything was different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen when she heard the wagon pull out of the yard. Noah was on the floor nearby, sitting up on his own now, batting at a wooden spool she'd given him to play with. She listened to the sound of the wheels on the frozen ground until it faded. The morning passed. She finished the laundry. She started a pot of soup. Noah slept and woke and ate and sat on the floor again and watched her with his dark, serious eyes that still, even now, when she was tired and scared in ways she was getting better at not admitting, made something loosen in her chest. By noon, she knew Walter wasn't coming back. Not because of anything she could point to, just a feeling, the same one she'd had as a child waiting for her father to come home from an errand that turned into a 3-day absence, the weight of an empty house that is supposed to be occupied, the particular silence of waiting that has become something else. She packed the travel bag. She didn't let herself think too much about it. She put in Noah's things first. His clothes, the small wool blanket she'd made on the train, the extra nappies. Then her own, as much as would fit. She put on every layer she owned. She bundled Noah against her chest and pulled her coat closed over him, and she walked out of Walter Briggs' house carrying everything she'd arrived with, plus the certainty, cold and clear as the air outside, that she had been brought here to be used and then discarded. She found the horse in the paddock. Not Walter's good horse, the other one, a mare who looked as uncertain about life as Clara felt. She had ridden before, years ago. She managed to get the saddle on. She managed to get herself up with Noah still wrapped against her. She headed toward what she thought was the direction of town. She was wrong about the direction. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped further, and the sky had gone the color that meant snow. And she was on a trail she didn't recognize in country she didn't know. And Noah was quiet in a way that scared her more than crying. She pushed the horse on. The wind picked up. The first snow came sideways, wet and heavy. The horse pulled up short at a dark shape in the trees, a cabin, abandoned by the look of it, one window covered with boards and a door that hung half off its hinges. She got down. Her legs nearly went out. She got the saddle off and left the horse with the reins loosely tied and pushed through the cabin door with her shoulder. Inside was out of the wind. Not warm, not even close to warm, but out of the wind. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and unbundled Noah enough to check him. His cheeks were cold. His eyes were open, watching her. She got her coat more firmly around both of them and pulled the wool blanket from the bag and wrapped it over everything she could reach. "Okay," she said to him. "Okay." She didn't know what she was promising. She just needed to say something out loud to make the silence less absolute. Outside, the snow came harder. Ethan Callahan had not planned to go out that evening. He had plans to spend the evening the way he spent most evenings, eating whatever was simplest to cook, reading by the fire until his eyes gave out, going to bed at an hour that would have embarrassed him 10 years ago. He was 43 years old, owned the largest working ranch in the valley, and had not had a real conversation with another person in 4 days. This did not bother him as much as people seemed to think it should. He'd seen Briggs's wagon come back through in the late afternoon. He'd been fixing a fence post on the north edge of his property, hands too cold to do it right, and he'd looked up when the wagon passed on the road below. Briggs was alone. That struck him as odd. He'd heard in town last week that Briggs was expecting his mail-order bride to arrive sometime this week. He'd thought nothing much about it at the time. Briggs's business was Briggs's business. But the empty wagon seat stayed with him through supper in a way he couldn't shake. He put on his coat around dusk, more out of restlessness than any clear intention, and went out to check on his horses. That was when he noticed the tracks. They came across the far corner of his north pasture and headed into the trees. One horse, moving irregularly, the gait of an animal that wasn't sure where it was going. He stood in the falling snow and followed the tracks with his eyes and thought about Briggs's wagon coming back empty. He got his own horse. The tracks weren't hard to follow in the fresh snow. They led through the trees and up a low rise and down the other side toward the old Decker cabin, which had been empty for 6 years and was cold enough in good weather to make you wish for somewhere else. He saw the horse first, tied outside, looking miserable but alive. Then he pushed open the cabin door and held up his lantern. The woman was sitting against the far wall with her coat pulled around her like a tent, and her eyes already open, already watching him, too exhausted to be startled. She looked at him the way people look at things they're not sure are real. He moved the lantern and saw the bundle under her coat shift. A small hand appeared at the edge of the fabric, 5 fingers, curled. "You Briggs's wife?" he said. He didn't know why that was the first thing he asked. It came out before he could think. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, considering. "I'm not anybody's anything." He crouched down to her level. In the lantern light, her face was pale and drawn, and there were tear tracks on her cheeks that had dried in the cold. She was trying to hold herself very still in the careful way of someone who has decided not to show how bad it is. "How long you been out here?" he said. "A few hours, I think. I lost track." She shifted the bundle against her. "He's cold. The baby. He was warmer before, but he's—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. Ethan took off his outer coat without thinking about it and held it out. She looked at it, then at him. "I've got another at the house," he said. She took the coat. She wrapped it around the baby, not herself, keeping Noah tucked inside it, pulling it shut with hands that were shaking more than she probably wanted them to. "I have a ranch about a 1/4 mile east," Ethan said. "Can you ride?" "I rode here?" "That's a yes, then." "That's a yes," she agreed. He helped her up. She was steadier on her feet than he expected, though she held the baby with a grip that wasn't letting go for anything on earth. He got the mare's reins and led both horses out of the trees, and the snow came down around them in the dark, and she walked beside him without asking where they were going, without asking anything at all, and he didn't try to fill the silence. There was time for explanations later. Right now there was just the cold and the snow and a baby who needed warmth, and a woman who had been left somewhere to die by a man who had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Ethan Callahan was not an impulsive man. He had spent most of his adult life being deliberate, cautious, careful with his decisions. But some things didn't require deliberation. Some things were just true the moment you walked through a door with a lantern and found them waiting for you in the dark. He held the mare's lead and walked east through the snow. Behind him, barely audible over the wind, he heard Clara say something very quietly to the baby. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't try to. He just kept walking. Ethan's house was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. Something rougher, maybe, or more neglected, the way a man's house gets when he's been alone in it too long. But the main room was orderly in a spare, functional way, the kind of order that comes not from tidiness as a virtue, but from a man who can't stand not knowing where things are. A fire was banked low in the hearth. There were books on a shelf beside the window, more than she would have guessed. A coat hung on a peg by the door. A single cup on the table, dried from its last use. Ethan went directly to the fire and built it up without ceremony. Clara stood in the middle of the room and held Noah and watched the flames catch. And for a moment she couldn't do anything else. The warmth hit her face, and she felt the muscles in her shoulders, which had been locked for hours, begin to release in a way that was almost painful. "Sit down before you fall down," Ethan said without looking at her. She sat in the chair nearest the fire. She unwrapped the coat he had lent her and got Noah out from under it and held him up to look at him in the firelight. His cheeks were still cold, but his eyes were tracking, watching the flames with the fixed, serious attention that babies give to light sources. His hands moved. He made a small sound, not distress, just presence, just, "I'm here." She let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, for most of the last several hours. "He's all right," she said. She wasn't sure if she was telling Ethan or herself. Let me get something warm for him. Ethan moved to the kitchen. She heard him working, the sound of the stove, water in a pan. He came back a few minutes later with a cup of warm milk, not hot, just warm, and a piece of cloth he'd torn from something clean. She used the cloth to let Noah suck the milk from it, which he did with enormous concentration, both fists clenched, entirely focused on the task. Ethan watched this from across the room. He had the expression of a man filing away information he didn't know what to do with yet. He eat solid food, he said. Some. He's 6 months. She kept her eyes on Noah. He likes soft things. I've been mashing whatever I can. Ethan nodded and went back to the kitchen. She heard him doing something else. She didn't ask. She was too tired to ask, and there was something about his manner, practical, direct, not making a production of any of it, that made asking feel unnecessary. He was just doing the next thing. She understood that. He came back with a bowl of soft cornmeal he'd cooked down until it was almost liquid, with a little butter worked into it. He set it on the table beside her without comment. Thank you, she said. He sat down across the fire from her, not close, not giving her space in a pointed way, just finding his own chair and settling into it. He looked at the fire. She fed Noah the cornmeal, a little at a time, on the tip of a spoon, and Noah ate it with the methodical focus that she had come to recognize as his temperament. Not rushed, not frantic, but very present, very deliberate, as if he intended to be thorough about everything he encountered in life. His name's Noah, she said. She didn't know why she offered it. It felt wrong to sit in someone's house in silence with a child he'd just rescued from the cold and not give the child a name. Ethan looked at the baby. Something in his face shifted slightly, not softening exactly, but adjusting. Good name. My grandfather's. A pause. Then, what's yours? Clara Whitmore. She hesitated. I never took his name. It wasn't. She stopped. There wasn't a ceremony. He decided he wanted one, and then he decided he didn't. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long were you there at Briggs's ranch? 16 days. He looked at the fire. Long way to come for 16 days. Yes, she said. It was. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and the fire cracked and settled, and Noah finished the cornmeal and looked around at the room with his serious dark eyes, and Clara sat in a stranger's chair in a stranger's house at the edge of a snowstorm, and felt very distantly the strange sensation of not being in immediate danger for the first time since she'd walked out of Walter Briggs's kitchen that morning. Ethan gave her the back room. He didn't make a ceremony of it, just showed her the door and said the bed was made and there were extra blankets in the trunk at the foot of it, and that she should sleep while the baby let her. She expected to lie awake. She was wrong. She was asleep within minutes, Noah tucked against her side, the blankets heavy and warm, and the sound of the wind outside muffled now to something almost bearable. She woke once in the night when Noah stirred, fed him in the dark, listened to the house settle around her. She could hear nothing from the main room. Ethan had made up something for himself somewhere. She hadn't asked, and she didn't know, and she wasn't sure what she felt about any of it except that she was warm, and Noah was warm, and for tonight that was the whole of what mattered. In the morning she woke before dawn out of old habit and lay still for a moment, remembering where she was. Not Walter's house, not her room at the boarding house in Concord, somewhere else. She got up carefully, not to wake Noah, and found her way to the kitchen. Ethan was already there. He looked up from the stove without surprise. Coffee, he said, and poured a cup and set it on the table. She sat down. The coffee was strong enough to make her eyes water, which was what she needed. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The world was white and silent, and the sky above the mountains was just beginning to go pink at the edges. I need to figure out my situation, she said. I know. I can't stay here. He sat down across from her with his own cup. You got somewhere to go? She thought about that honestly. Her sister in Concord was in a one-room apartment with her husband and 2 small children. There was no money for a train ticket, even if she had somewhere to land at the end of it. She had $11.40 in the bottom of the travel bag. Not immediately, she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He didn't offer easy reassurances, which she respected. "Stay until you figure it out," he said. "I've got the room." "I don't take charity." "I'm not offering charity. My kitchen's a wreck. My mending's been sitting for 6 weeks, and I haven't had a decent meal made by someone who actually knows what they're doing since—" He stopped, looked at his coffee cup. "For a while. You want to earn your keep, there's work here. But it's your choice." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. His eyes were on the window, on the pink sky coming up over the mountains. His jaw had a set to it that suggested he'd said what he meant to say and was done elaborating. "What would people say?" she said. "A woman staying here alone?" "Probably nothing good." "That doesn't bother you?" He looked at her then, directly, with an expression that was neither defiant nor careless, but simply settled. "People in this valley have been saying things about me since my wife died 7 years ago. I'm still here. They're still talking." He lifted the cup. "Let them." Clara wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the pink sky and thought about $11.40 and a 6-month-old boy and 11 days on a train and 16 days of getting smaller and quieter and more careful until the man she'd come to marry decided she wasn't worth keeping. "All right," she said. "For now." The first week was awkward in the specific way of two people who don't know each other's rhythms negotiating the same space. Clara found the kitchen's disorder worse than Ethan had implied. Not dirty, but deeply disorganized, the result of a man cooking alone out of necessity rather than inclination and putting things wherever was closest. She reorganized without making a project of it, just moving things to where they made sense, and Ethan noticed and said nothing, which she took to mean he didn't object. She cooked real meals for the first time in weeks. Not complicated things. She didn't know what he liked yet, and she wasn't going to ask, but solid, honest food, the kind that filled a person up. The first time she put a proper supper on the table, Ethan sat down, looked at the plate for a moment, and said, "Huh." Then he ate. It was not eloquent, but it was genuine, and she found she preferred it to any number of more polished responses. Noah, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation of the house. He was 6 months old and recently mobile in the unpredictable way of babies who have just discovered that moving is a possibility and have not yet developed judgment about obstacles. He rolled across the floor. He grabbed the edge of things. He put whatever he could reach into his mouth with great seriousness, including one afternoon the fringe of a rug, which Clara extracted while Ethan watched from the doorway with an expression she couldn't decipher. "He get into things?" Ethan said. "Constantly." "What did he just eat?" "Rug fringe. He's fine. He does this." She got Noah settled on his back and offered him a wooden spoon to redirect him with. He accepted it and began examining it closely. "He's thorough," she said, "about everything." Ethan looked at Noah for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that." He went back to whatever he'd been doing. Clara watched him go and thought, not all men are the same. She had known this theoretically. She was learning it again in practice, slowly, the way you relearn a thing that fear has temporarily buried. The mending was indeed 6 weeks of accumulation. Shirts with missing buttons, a pair of trousers with a split seam, 2 pairs of heavy wool socks that needed darning at the heels. Clara worked through it methodically in the evenings while Noah slept, and found the work restful in the way of tasks that require attention, but not worry. Ethan sat on the other side of the fire those evenings, reading or doing the accounts. He was not the kind of man who felt compelled to fill silence, which suited her perfectly. But some evenings he asked questions, not prying ones, not the kind that were looking for weakness, just practical, careful questions that suggested genuine curiosity. "What did you do back east, before?" "Laundry, mostly. Some sewing work. Dry goods store for a while." She knotted a thread and bit it off. "I was good at keeping track of inventory. Numbers don't argue back." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "What about you?" she said. "How long have you had the ranch?" 12 years. Came out here with my wife when we were both too young to know what we were getting into." He turned a page. "She died 7 years ago. Winter fever. Happened fast." "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He said it plainly, without the careful neutral tone people use when they want to signal that the subject is closed. Just, yeah. It happened. "She would have liked the noise," he said after a moment, not looking up from the book. She always said the house was too quiet. Clara looked at Noah, asleep on his blanket on the floor. It won't be quiet for long. Once he starts walking, it's a different situation entirely. Ethan looked at Noah too. I know, he said, but there was something in his voice that she couldn't quite classify. Not dread, not exactly anticipation, something in between. Yet, the town found out about Clara within a week. She had known it would. This was a small valley. Ethan's ranch was known to everyone in it, and the woman who had arrived on Walter Briggs's wagon was not going to disappear without questions. She didn't know exactly how it traveled, whether someone had seen them come in through the snow that first night, or whether Ethan had mentioned it in town, or whether the empty horse she'd left behind had been found and talked about. But by the following Wednesday, when Ethan rode in for supplies, he came back with a set expression she hadn't seen on him before. He put the supplies on the table and stood there for a moment. Briggs is telling people you took the horse without permission, he said. Clara had been washing up after supper. She didn't stop, just kept her hands moving through the water. That's one way to tell it. He's also saying the baby's his son, not yours. She did stop then. She turned around. Ethan was looking at her steadily. Noah is mine, she said. Biologically, Noah belongs to Walter. He is also the man who left a 6-month-old infant in a cabin in a snowstorm and drove home alone. Those two things are both true. Ethan nodded. I know. Do the people in town know? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. What are they saying about you, she said. That I made a mistake bringing you here. He pulled out a chair and sat down. That I'm hiding what belongs to Briggs. A few of them are saying worse things. He looked at the table. About you, about why a woman might need somewhere to stay. The implication was plain enough. Clara felt a familiar anger move through her. Not the hot kind, but the cold kind, the kind that had been with her since she was a girl, since the first time someone had decided that a woman without resources was automatically a woman without standards. What did you say? She said. I said they could mind their business. Is that all? I said it twice. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. That's not going to be enough. No, he agreed. It's not. He looked up. You have any documents, any letters, anything that shows you and Briggs had an agreement? She had kept the letters, all of them, tied together at the bottom of the travel bag, which was one of the things she'd been meticulous about even in her hurry to pack. Letters from Walter promising her a home. Letters where she had disclosed the situation with Noah, and his replies that said it was not a problem. She had kept them the way women in uncertain situations keep things, not expecting to need them, but knowing the world. Yes, she said. Ethan looked at her carefully. Good. Keep them somewhere safe. She already had. She didn't say that. She just nodded and turned back to the wash basin. Bam. Walter Briggs came to the ranch 11 days after Clara arrived there. She was in the yard when he came, hanging the washing on the line Ethan had strung between two posts, Noah in a basket near her feet, watching the sheets move in the wind with academic interest. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and when she looked up and saw Walter coming down the road toward the gate, something went very cold and very still inside her. She picked up Noah and held him against her hip and did not move. Walter pulled up at the gate. He didn't dismount. He looked at her from horseback with the expression she had last seen in the kitchen of his house. Not angry, exactly, not even contemptuous, just flat, assessing, the look of a man calculating something. I want the boy, he said. No, Clara said. He's mine. You left him in a cabin to freeze. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He was cold when I got to him. He was cold when this man found us and brought us here. You made your choice about this child 11 days ago. I changed my mind. She stared at him, the flatness of it. I changed my mind, as if Noah were a piece of equipment he'd decided he needed back, as if there were nothing else to consider. You can't change your mind about a child, she said. Law says different. He's got my blood. She held Noah tighter. Noah, for his part, was looking at Walter with those dark, serious eyes, utterly without recognition, because Walter Briggs had never once held him for long enough to be remembered. The sound of the back door opening pulled her attention for a fraction of a second. Ethan came across the yard, not hurrying, not running, but moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who has already decided something. He stopped beside Clara. He didn't say anything to her. He looked at Walter on the horse. "You need something, Briggs," he said. "This is none of your affair, Callahan. Woman and child are on my property. Makes it my affair." Walter's jaw tightened. "She's not your wife." "No," Ethan said, "but she's not your property either, which seems to be what you're confused about." He kept his voice even, not threatening, not performing calm, just genuinely steady, the way some men are when they've already thought through where they stand and aren't worried about being pushed off it. "You want to make a legal claim on the boy, you talk to the sheriff. You want to stand at my gate and frighten a woman, you can ride back the way you came." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then at Noah, who looked back at him without expression. "This isn't finished," Walter said. "I know it's not," Ethan said. "Come back with the sheriff." Walter wheeled his horse and left. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go and did not let herself shake until she heard the sound of the hooves fade around the bend. Then she let herself shake, just for a moment, just enough to release what had built up, before she got steady again. Ethan stood beside her. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything reassuring. He just stood there, which was the right thing, though she couldn't have explained why. After a while, he said, "He'll come back with the sheriff. I know. You'll need those letters. I know that too." He nodded, looked at Noah, who had lost interest in the gate and was now engaged with a button on Clara's coat. "He's not going to get the boy," Ethan said. Not as a promise. He wasn't a man who made promises he couldn't keep, but as a statement of where things stood, as he currently understood them. Clara looked at him. "You don't know that for certain." "No," he admitted. "But I know Briggs, and I know what a man who abandoned his child in a snowstorm looks like when he wants that child back. He doesn't want the boy. He wants to win." He said it without heat, just observation. Different thing entirely. She thought about that. Noah found the button, decided it wasn't interesting enough, and switched his attention to the collar of her coat. "What do I do in the meantime?" she said. Ethan turned back toward the house. "The same thing you've been doing," he said over his shoulder. "Work. Take care of him. Don't run." It was not complicated advice. It was exactly the kind of advice that was easy to give and very hard to take when you were alone and afraid and 1,100 miles from anywhere that used to feel like home. But Clara stood in the yard with Noah on her hip and the cold air coming off the mountains and the clean smell of the sheets moving on the line, and thought, all right. She had run from nothing in her life that mattered. She was not going to start now. The weeks that followed had a shape to them that she hadn't expected. Not peace exactly, because the situation with Walter was still out there, unresolved, waiting, but a kind of working rhythm that she fell into the way you fall into a difficult piece of music once you've practiced it enough times to stop fighting the tempo. She managed the household. She cooked and cleaned and organized and mended and did the accounts when Ethan let her look at them, which he did after the second week when he came in from the barn to find her reorganizing the kitchen stores and stopped and watched her for a moment and said, "You good with numbers?" And she said yes, and he said books are in the desk, and that was the end of it. The books were badly kept in the specific way of a man who is meticulous about everything except paperwork. She sorted them out over 3 evenings and left them on the table with a list of what she'd found, and in the morning they were gone from the table, and Ethan said, $3 off, third column, November. And she went back and found the error and corrected it, and that was apparently all that needed to be said. She helped with the animals. Not the hard physical work. She wasn't strong enough for most of it, but she could feed and water, and she could tell by looking when an animal wasn't right. She caught a ewe with a bad leg early, before it got worse, and Ethan fixed it and the ewe recovered, and he said good eye. And she filed that away and kept watching. Noah grew. It happened with the speed that she still hadn't gotten used to, the way babies rearrange themselves every few weeks into something slightly different and more themselves. He learned to pull himself to standing against the furniture, He began making sounds that were very nearly words. Ma, and something that might have been more that he used for everything he wanted. He found Hitch the dog interesting, and Hitch found him baffling but ultimately tolerable, which Clara thought was probably the beginning of a useful relationship. Ethan watched Noah in the careful, peripheral way of a man who doesn't want to be caught watching. She noticed this and said nothing about it, but she saw it. The way Ethan would be doing something else entirely, and Noah would make a sound and Ethan's eyes would go to him, just for a second, automatic, before going back to what he was doing. The way he'd started leaving things low and accessible that Noah might be able to safely grab. The cup of wooden spoons on the kitchen floor that had appeared without explanation one afternoon. She didn't comment on any of it. She was not going to make it into something he'd have to defend or explain. Some things were better left just happening. 3 weeks after Walter's visit, the sheriff came. His name was Aldous Crane, and he was a large man with a careful expression and the air of someone who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little of it. He came alone, which Clara took as a moderate sign. He knocked at the front door and removed his hat when she answered it. "Ma'am," he said. "You'd be Clara Whitmore?" "I would." "Sheriff Crane. I've had a complaint registered by Walter Briggs regarding a child he claims is his by blood. I'm here to—" "Come in," she said. "I have letters." He blinked, just slightly. Apparently he had not expected that. He came in and sat at the table, and she put the letters in front of him, organized in order, the complete correspondence from September through November. She sat across from him and let him read. Ethan came in from outside while the sheriff was reading. He looked at the table, looked at Clara, and sat down at the far end without asking questions. The sheriff read for a long time. He was methodical about it, which she respected. He did not skim. When he finished, he set the last letter down and looked at it. "This letter here," he said, "the one from November. He says he's sending the train money." "Yes." "He doesn't say anything about the child, one way or the other." "No, he didn't address it. I had disclosed it in October. That letter is there, third from the top. He sent the train money without responding to the disclosure. I took that as acceptance." The sheriff looked at Ethan. "You were the one found them?" "Yes." "Briggs' place?" "Old Decker cabin, quarter-mile east of his property line." Ethan's voice was even. 6 months old, 4 hours in a cabin with no fire in a snowstorm. Woman's hands were near frozen. Crane looked at the letters again. He was quiet for a moment. "Briggs says she took the horse without permission," he said. "She did," Ethan said. "She also used it to not die. I'd say that's fair trade." Something moved at the corner of Crane's mouth, but he kept his expression professional. He tapped the edge of the letters together and squared the stack. "I'm not going to make a determination today," he said, "but I'll tell you what I see here. I see a written agreement. I see a man who did not respond to disclosed information, and I see a man who drove away from his wife and infant in dangerous conditions." He paused. "What I don't see is anything that makes me think I'm picking up this child and handing him back to the man who left him." Clara let out a breath. "That's not a final ruling," Crane said, looking at her directly. "Briggs has the right to pursue this legally. It may go further, but for now—" He stood, put his hat back on. "You keep those letters safe, ma'am. Don't let them out of your possession." "I won't," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. "You doing all right here?" The question surprised her. She hadn't expected it. "Yes," she said, "better than I was." He nodded. He looked at Noah, who was sitting on the floor near the fire, regarding the sheriff's boots with considerable interest. Crane looked at the baby for a moment in the way that even men who do not particularly like children tend to look at 6-month-olds, with a kind of helpless recognition. "Good-looking boy," he said. "He is," Clara said. The sheriff left. Clara sat at the table and did not move for a moment. Ethan stayed where he was. The fire cracked. Noah decided the boots were gone, but the interesting floor was still there and went back to examining it. "That was better than I expected," Clara said finally. "Crane's a fair man," Ethan said. "He doesn't like Briggs." "Why not?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Because 6 years ago Briggs had a hand he accused of stealing from him. Man was new, didn't have anyone to speak for him. Briggs pushed Crane hard to act fast, and Crane did. And then it came out later the hand hadn't done it. Briggs had miscounted his own inventory. He looked at the fire. Crane's been careful about Briggs ever since. Clara thought about that. The slow accumulation of a man's pattern and the people who eventually learn to read it. He'll go back to Briggs, she said. Yes. And Briggs will push harder. Yes. She looked at Noah. He had found a crease in the floorboard he found interesting and was investigating it with one finger, completely absorbed. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, she said. Ethan looked at her. It was the same careful, direct look he'd given her that first morning, the one that meant he was actually paying attention, not just going through the motion of it. Yeah, he said. We will. The word "we" sat in the air between them for a moment. Neither of them remarked on it. But it was there, and they both knew it, and the fire burned on in the quiet room, and outside the valley lay cold and white and full of whatever came next. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was from Walter before she opened it, because it had been delivered by Briggs's hand. Not the man himself, but a boy from town who said he'd been paid a nickel to bring it out. She stood at the front door and looked at the envelope for a moment after the boy left, and then she went inside and set it on the table and put water on for coffee before she opened it. Ethan came in from his barn while she was reading it. He looked at her face and then at the paper in her hand and sat down without being asked. She slid it across the table when she finished. He read it. His expression didn't change much while he read. That was one of the things she'd come to understand about him, that his face was not where his reactions lived. But when he set it down, there was a stillness about him that she recognized as the equivalent of anger in a man who had learned to keep his anger on a very short leash. The letter said that Walter Briggs, having consulted with an attorney in Cheyenne, intended to appear before the circuit judge at the next county session, 6 weeks hence, to establish legal paternity of the child Noah and to petition for the child's return to his custody. It said further that Clara's presence in the home of Ethan Callahan, a man to whom she bore no legal relation, would be noted as a factor relevant to the question of moral fitness. The phrasing was a lawyer's phrasing, careful and cold, designed to wound without leaving marks. Ethan read it twice. Then he turned it face down on the table. 6 weeks, he said. Yes. He found himself a lawyer fast. He had time to plan this, Clara said. He knew what he was doing when he left us. He thought I wouldn't survive the night, and when I did, he needed a different strategy. She kept her voice even. She had been over this in her own head enough times that it had worn smooth like a stone in a river. Now, his strategy is to make me look like the problem. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The moral fitness language. Yes. Because you're living here. Because I'm a woman living in a man's house without being his wife. She looked at him directly. People have already been saying it. He's just putting it in a letter now. Ethan picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking, not drinking, just holding, using the warmth of it to anchor himself. She had noticed that weeks ago and never mentioned it. What do you want to do? He said. It was the question she had been sitting with since the letter arrived, turning it over, testing its edges. She had options technically. She could write to her sister. She could try to find work in town. Though what work and where, she didn't know, and she couldn't take Noah to most of the places that might have her. She could find somewhere else to stay, some household that needed help, some situation that would look better on paper than this one did. She could also stay. I want to fight it, she said, in court. In court. With the letters, with whatever Sheriff Crane can say about the condition I was in when Ethan... She stopped, caught herself. When you found us. He noticed the slip but said nothing about it. Crane will testify. He's already halfway convinced. Halfway isn't enough. No, he agreed. It's not. He set the cup down. I know a man in Laramie, lawyer named Gideon Holt. He's not cheap, but he's competent, and he doesn't lose cases he should win. He paused. That's not the same as not losing, but it's something. I don't have money for a lawyer. I know. She looked at him. He met her eyes and didn't look away. and she understood what he was offering and felt the specific discomfort of it. Not quite pride, not quite fear, something in between that came from years of not asking people for things because asking always had a cost. "Ethan, it's not alone," he said, before she could find the word. "Don't make it something we have to keep accounts on. Just let me help." She was quiet for a long moment. Noah was on the floor with Hitch, doing the thing he'd recently discovered, which was grabbing fistfuls of the dog's coat and using him as a support to practice standing. Hitch accepted this with the martyrdom of an old soldier. "All right," she said. Gideon Holt came from Laramie 2 weeks later, and he was not what Clara had pictured from Ethan's description. She had expected someone substantial, someone who filled a room. Holt was slight and gray-haired and wore spectacles that he took off and put back on repeatedly while he talked, as if his thoughts moved faster than his hands. He sat at Ethan's table and read through the letters 3 times and asked Clara questions for the better part of an afternoon in a tone that suggested he found her answers genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. He asked about the October letter, the one disclosing Noah's situation and her own medical history. He asked her to walk him through exactly what the Cheyenne area physician had told her before she'd left, and what Walter had said when she arrived about the disclosure. He asked her to describe plainly and in order the 16 days she'd spent at Briggs's ranch. She described them. She didn't embellish. She had never been good at embellishment, and she'd learned early that the plain truth laid out clearly was usually more useful than any version dressed up to look better. When she finished, Holt took his spectacles off and looked at them. "The moral fitness argument is thin," he said. "It's designed to distract and intimidate. In a rational courtroom, a woman who kept a child alive in a snowstorm is not going to lose a fitness hearing to the man who created the snowstorm." He put the spectacles back on. "The question is whether this judge is rational." "Is he?" Ethan said. "Judge Alderman." Holt considered. "He is when the case is clear. He gets muddled when there's social pressure." He looked at Clara. "There will be social pressure." "From Briggs's people," she said. "From anyone who wants this to go a certain way. Briggs has been in this valley a long time. He has associations. He'll make sure the right people are in that courtroom." He paused. "So will we. That's the other half of the work." After Holt left, Clara sat at the table in the quiet of the afternoon and thought about the word associations. She had been here 2 months now. She knew the names of Ethan's neighbors. She had met a few of them: the Garner family on the South Road, a woman named Ruth Parsley who had come by one afternoon with a suspicious expression that had softened somewhat when Clara had given her coffee and not said anything foolish. She knew that Ethan was respected in this valley, but respected in the particular way of a man who keeps to himself, acknowledged, not warmly known. She thought about what it would take to fill a courtroom with people who would speak the truth about what had happened, and she thought about whether the truth, without witnesses, was enough. She went into town for the first time 3 days later. Ethan offered to come with her. She told him no. She had thought about this carefully, and she was clear on one thing. If she arrived in Harlan with Ethan Callahan standing beside her, every conversation would be about him, not her. The story would be his generosity, his judgment, his choice. She needed people to see her, not who she came with, but who she was. She drove the wagon herself. Noah sat in the basket she'd rigged to the seat beside her, strapped in with a length of cloth she'd fashioned into a kind of harness, regarding the landscape with his usual gravity. The drive was 40 minutes, and the cold was manageable, and she talked to Noah the whole way, pointing out things she saw: a hawk overhead, a line of fence posts, the mountains to the west going gray under a flat sky. The town of Harlan was small and organized in the practical way of frontier settlements, with the things people needed most closest to the center. She tied the horse at the post outside the general store and took Noah inside. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned back and a face that had made up its mind about most things years ago. She looked at Clara when she came in, looked at Noah, and said nothing for a moment. "You'll be the woman from Callahan's ranch," she said. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Yes." Mabel Stott. The woman's expression was not unfriendly exactly, but it was measuring. "What do you need?" Clara gave her the list she'd made: flour, salt, some lamp oil. Mabel began pulling things from the shelves without hurry. Clara took Noah out of his wrappings and held him against her hip, and Noah looked around the store with the interested expression he brought to new environments. That's Briggs's boy, Mabel said, not as an accusation, just a statement. This is Noah, Clara said. He's mine. Mabel looked at Noah for a moment. Noah looked back at her. He then did what he had recently taken to doing with strangers. He put one hand out toward them, just extended it, a gesture that seemed to mean something like, I acknowledge you. Mabel stared at the extended hand. Then she reached out one finger and let Noah take it. He's got Briggs's coloring, she said. He does. Not much else. She looked at Clara. Walter Briggs has owed me money since August. For grain he said he'd paid for and hadn't. She said this as a plain fact without drama. I'm not interested in doing him any favors. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. Mabel looked at Noah again, who was still holding her finger with complete commitment. Heard about what happened, the cabin. She shook her head, a small motion. Man's a fool. Clara said nothing. Some opinions you didn't argue with. You need anything beyond what's on this list? Mabel said. Not today. Mabel tallied up what she'd pulled and Clara paid for it, and Mabel wrapped the packages and said as Clara was leaving, There's a women's sewing circle meets at Ruth Parsley's house Thursday afternoons, in case you were looking for somewhere to be. Clara stopped at the door. She turned around. Thursday? She said. 2:00, Mabel said. She was already moving to the back of the store, done with the conversation. Clara went to the sewing circle on Thursday. She sat in Ruth Parsley's front room with 6 other women and sewed a hem she didn't need sewn and answered questions carefully and honestly and watched people decide what they thought of her in real time. It was not comfortable, but discomfort was not the same as useless. Ruth Parsley, it turned out, had opinions. She was a forthright woman of about 50 with the kind of directness that could go either way, generous or cutting depending on the subject. She had come to visit Clara at Ethan's ranch 6 weeks earlier with a suspicious expression and left with a somewhat altered one, and at the sewing circle she said plainly in front of everyone, I've been out to Callahan's. The woman keeps a clean house, and the baby is well cared for. That's what I saw. No one argued with Ruth Parsley, and no one did now. There was a woman named Edna Croft who sat in the corner and said very little, and whose husband, Clara learned later, played cards with Walter Briggs on Friday evenings. Clara noticed how Edna listened, the quality of her silence, and she was careful about what she said within earshot of that particular corner. She was not paranoid. She was practical. There was a difference. She came home from the sewing circle and told Ethan what had happened. Not all of it, just the shape of it. And he listened and said, Ruth's word counts for something around here. I know, Clara said. That's why I went. He looked at her. Not for the first time, she had the sense that he was reevaluating something, adjusting his estimate of her upward in some incremental way. She didn't find it flattering exactly. She found it accurate. Done. The 4 weeks before the hearing moved in a way that was both very slow and very fast. Clara drove into town twice more, bought things she needed and things she didn't quite need as an excuse for the trip, talked to people, answered questions. She was not performing warmth she didn't feel. That kind of performance exhausted her and showed eventually. But she was genuinely interested in people's situations, had always been, and it turned out that genuine interest was more useful than any strategy she could have planned. She learned things. She learned that Walter Briggs had borrowed against his property 3 years running and that there were 2 men in the valley who held his notes and were quietly anxious about it. She learned that the sheriff, Crane, had spoken to 2 witnesses who had been at the rail station in Cheyenne the day Clara arrived, who remembered Briggs meeting the wagon and could testify to the child being with Clara from the start of their arrival. She learned from Ruth Parsley in a lowered voice at the end of a Thursday sewing circle that the woman Briggs had employed as a housekeeper 2 winters ago had left his employ without collecting her last 2 weeks' wages and had not explained why. None of this was proof of anything on its own, but it was the texture of a man's life, the accumulation of how he treated people when he thought it didn't cost him anything. And Clara had learned over the years that texture was what juries and judges felt, even when they couldn't articulate it. She told Holt all of it. He listened and made notes and said useful several times, which she took to mean that it was. Meanwhile, Noah learned to walk. It happened the way major things often happen. in an ordinary moment with no preparation. She was folding laundry in the main room, and he was holding on to the edge of the settle, rocking back and forth in the experimental way he'd been doing for 2 weeks. Then he let go. He stood for 3 seconds, freestanding, with an expression of pure concentration. Then he took 2 steps toward the laundry basket and sat down hard on the floor and looked up at her. She put down the shirt she was holding. "Ethan!" she called. He came from the kitchen. He looked at Noah on the floor. Noah, aware of an audience, grabbed the edge of the settle again and hauled himself up and let go again, and took 3 steps this time before sitting back down. Ethan crouched down to Noah's level. Noah looked at him with tremendous seriousness and then took another step, wobbled, and grabbed Ethan's outstretched hand to steady himself. It was not a gesture Ethan had planned. She could see that, the slight surprise on his face as the small hand closed around his fingers, the same automatic grip that she remembered from the first night, the way Noah held on when he needed to. Ethan held very still. Noah stood there, holding on, and looked around the room from this new vantage point as if everything were slightly different from standing height. "Huh," Ethan said softly. Clara watched them. She did not comment on what she saw on his face in that moment. The thing she had no name for yet, the thing that had been building for weeks and was still unfinished, still working itself out beneath the surface of a man who had been alone for a very long time. Some things needed to be left room to grow. The day before the hearing, Walter Briggs made his last move. Clara was in the yard when she saw dust on the road. Not 1 rider, but 4. Briggs in front, and behind him 2 men she didn't recognize, and one she did. Doyle, the neighbor who'd been at the fence the night she'd overheard Walter in his kitchen. They pulled up at the gate, and this time Walter dismounted. She stood her ground. She did not go inside. She had Noah on her hip, and she stood in the yard and waited. Walter came through the gate like a man who had already won something. He stopped 10 feet from her, close enough that the 2 strangers behind him were a clear presence, a weight. "I'm going to offer you something," he said. "Once. And if you don't take it, I won't offer it again." "I'm listening," she said. "You drop the hearing tomorrow. You turn over the boy. You get back on whatever transportation Callahan's willing to pay for, and you go back east." He kept his voice measured, almost reasonable. "I won't pursue any charges about the horse. We call it finished." Clara looked at him. She had thought she would feel more when this moment came. More fear, more fury. What she felt was mostly tired. Tired of a specific kind, the kind that comes not from work, but from having to keep explaining to someone why you're a person. "No," she said. Something flickered in Walter's expression. "Clara." "Don't." Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, and she didn't soften it. "Don't use my name like we're having a reasonable conversation. You left this child in a frozen building. You left me there on purpose, in weather you knew was dangerous, with no food and no fire, because you decided we were inconvenient." Noah shifted on her hip, and she adjusted her hold on him without taking her eyes off Walter. "You can bring whoever you want to that courtroom tomorrow. You can have your lawyer say whatever he's going to say. But you do not get to stand in this yard and offer me a deal like you're doing me a favor." Walter's jaw was tight. One of the strangers behind him moved slightly, and she heard the back door of the house open. Ethan came across the yard. He walked at a normal pace, not rushing, but he didn't stop until he was standing beside Clara, close enough that his shoulder was near hers. He looked at the strangers first, then at Doyle, then at Walter. "You bringing witnesses to a conversation, Briggs?" he said. "Just making sure there are no misunderstandings," Walter said. "Seems like the understanding is pretty clear." Ethan looked at him. She said, "No, you're on private property. Get out." "You're making an enemy," Walter said. "I've had worse." Ethan's voice was flat, not hostile, the way a wall is flat. "I said get out." Walter looked at Clara one more time. She saw the calculation in it, the assessment of whether there was anything left to try, any pressure he hadn't applied yet. She held his gaze and didn't give him anything. He left. The 3 men with him left. Doyle was the last one through the gate, and he looked back once, not at Clara, but at Ethan, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite guilt, not quite apology, something in that direction. When they were gone, Ethan let out a breath that was steadier than she expected. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She was shaking slightly, but that was just adrenaline, just the body doing what it did when something it perceived as a threat walked away. "He's scared," she said. "Yes. That's why he came. He thinks he's going to lose tomorrow." Ethan looked at the road where the dust was still settling. He might be right. She nodded slowly. She looked down at Noah, who had watched the whole exchange with his dark, serious eyes, and was now extremely interested in the button at Clara's collar. She carried him inside. She sat down at the table and held him in her lap and let the shaking pass, which it did, the way things pass when you stay still and let them. Ethan came in and set the coffee pot on and said nothing, and she was grateful for that specific silence in the way she was grateful for very few things in this life. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of winter day that is beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Clara was up before dawn, dressed and ready before Ethan came into the kitchen. She had Noah in the good wool blanket. She had the letters in a leather folder Holt had given her to carry them in. She had not slept especially well, but she had slept, which was better than nothing. Ethan looked at her when he came in and said, "You ready?" "As I'll ever be," she said. They drove to town in the wagon. It was a 40-minute drive and they made it mostly in silence, but a different kind of silence than the early weeks, when silence had been the space between two people who didn't know each other yet. This one was the kind that comes when two people are thinking about the same thing and don't need to name it. The county hearing was held in the largest room of the town hall, which doubled as the meeting place and the occasional dance floor. When Clara and Ethan arrived, there were already more people there than she had expected. She stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked. Ruth Parsley was there, sitting near the front with two women from the sewing circle. Mabel Stott was there, in her good coat. Sheriff Crane was near the front, talking to Holt, who had arrived the previous day and was now arranging papers on a table with the methodical calm of a man who has been in rooms like this before and is not especially impressed by them. On the other side of the room, Walter Briggs sat with his attorney, a man from Cheyenne that Clara had not seen before. There were people behind Walter, too, men she recognized as his associations, the ones Holt had warned her about. Doyle was there. Two men she'd seen at the grain merchant's. But there were more people on the other side of the room than she had expected. She walked to her seat and sat down and held Noah in her lap and looked at the judge's table at the front of the room. Holt came and sat beside her and spread his papers. "Decent turnout," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "People like a clear case," he said, "even when they say they don't." The judge came in and the room settled. Judge Alderman was older than she'd pictured, with a heavy gray beard and the tired eyes of a man who has listened to more arguments than he wanted to in his lifetime. He sat down and looked at the room and at the papers in front of him, and then at Clara, and then at Walter, with the expression of a man taking inventory. Walter's attorney spoke first. He was polished and precise, and he made the argument Clara had expected: paternity, bloodline, the legal standing of a father's claim. He used the phrase moral environment twice, with a careful glance at the crowd each time he said it. He said that a child being raised in an irregular domestic situation, his phrasing, deserved the stability of his father's home and name. He did not mention the cabin. He did not mention the snowstorm. Clara noticed this, and she suspected Judge Alderman noticed it too, because his tired eyes moved to Walter Briggs at one point while the attorney was speaking, with the particular look of a man who is waiting for something and has not heard it yet. Then Holt stood up. He did not begin with arguments. He began with the letters. He read portions of them aloud, but not all, just the relevant passages, the October letter with its plain disclosure, the Cheyenne money that came back with no response to the disclosure, the implied acceptance. His voice was dry and precise, and he did not editorialize. He simply laid the correspondence in front of the room like stones in a path and let people walk it. Then he called Sheriff Crane. Crane testified in the same plain voice he used for everything. He described what he'd been told and what he'd seen: his visit to Ethan's ranch, the condition of Clara's hands, the folder of letters, the timeline established by the correspondence. He described Walter's initial complaint and the nature of the counter-evidence. He did not offer opinions. He offered facts in the careful sequence of a man who has testified before and knows that sequence is what holds. Walter's attorney cross-examined with the phrase, "moral fitness twice more." Crane looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard worse questions. "The child appears healthy," Crane said. "Well cared for. Clearly attached to his mother. Those are the facts I observed." "And the domestic arrangement?" the attorney pressed. "Two adults in a large ranch house is what I observed," Crane said. "Beyond that, you're asking me to speculate, and that's not my place." Clara kept her face still. Then Holt said, "I'd like to call Clara Whitmore." She handed Noah to Ethan, who took him without a word. She walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair beside the judge's table and looked out at the assembled faces of Harlan, Wyoming Territory. Holt asked her to describe, in her own words, the day she left Walter Briggs's ranch. She described it. She did not dramatize. She used the same voice she had used with Holt in their 2 weeks of preparation. Plain, sequential, true. She described the conversation at breakfast, the silence, the hours passing, the certainty that arrived in the early afternoon, the packing, the horse, the trails she didn't know and weather that was getting worse. She described the cabin. She described the hours on the floor with Noah wrapped inside her coat, with the cold coming through the walls. She described Ethan's lantern in the doorway. The room was very quiet. Holt asked, "Miss Whitmore, in the 16 days you spent at Mr. Briggs's ranch, did he at any point indicate to you that he intended to dissolve the arrangement?" "No," she said. "Did he at any point ask you to leave?" "No." "Did he give you any warning, on the morning he left for town, that he did not intend to return?" "No." "And the child, had Mr. Briggs, in those 16 days, formed what you would describe as a paternal attachment to the boy?" She thought about it honestly. She looked at her hands. "He looked at Noah the way some people look at a problem they're trying to decide whether to solve or walk away from," she said. "In the end, he walked away." Silence. Walter's attorney rose and asked her 3 questions designed to establish that the living arrangement at Ethan's ranch was improper. She answered all 3 the same way, without anger and without apology. She was an employed member of the household. She managed the house in exchange for room and board, and the arrangement had been plainly discussed. "Do you intend this arrangement to be permanent?" the attorney asked. Clara looked at him, then she looked at the judge. "I intend to make a home for my son," she said, "whatever that requires." The attorney sat down. Holt said he had one more witness. Walter Briggs's attorney objected on the grounds of relevance before the witness was even named. Judge Alderman overruled the objection with the mildly irritated expression of a man who prefers to see things before deciding they're irrelevant. Ethan Callahan walked to the front of the room. He handed Noah to Mabel Stott, who took the baby with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who has managed more complicated situations. Noah looked at Mabel, she looked at him, and an apparent agreement was reached. Ethan sat in the chair and looked at the judge. Holt asked him to describe finding Clara and Noah. He did. He described it the way he described most things, without ornamentation, without drama, just the sequence of what happened. The empty wagon seat coming back past his fence line, the tracks in the snow, the lantern and the open door, and the woman against the wall with a baby under her coat. He described Clara's hands, the color of them, how they shook when she tried to take his coat. He described Noah's temperature. "In your assessment," Holt said, "was the child in danger?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Serious danger?" "If I'd gone to bed instead of going out," Ethan said, "I don't think the boy would have made the morning." The room was very still. Walter's attorney stood. "And you took it upon yourself to—" "I took it upon myself to not leave a baby to freeze," Ethan said. His voice was even. "I'd do it again tomorrow." The attorney sat down. Walter Briggs was looking at the table in front of him. Clara, from her seat, watched his profile, check the tight jaw, the set of his shoulders. He was not a man who showed much, she had learned that. But in that moment she saw something she hadn't expected. Not shame, exactly, but the expression of a man who understands, for the first time, that the story being told about him is the true one, and that the room believes it. Judge Alderman looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked at Noah, who had decided Mabel Stott was interesting and was attempting to investigate the brooch on her coat. I've heard enough, the judge said. Clara did not let herself move. A man's biological connection to a child establishes a legal starting point, Alderman said, in the measured tone of a man choosing each word with care. It does not establish the whole of the case. What I've heard today is a pattern, established in writing, corroborated by multiple witnesses, of a man who entered an agreement, received full disclosure of the relevant circumstances, and then abandoned both the woman and the child to conditions that any reasonable person would understand to be dangerous. He paused. The petition for paternal custody is denied. Walter Briggs' attorney was on his feet immediately, speaking in rapid legal terms about appeals and jurisdiction. The judge held up a hand and the attorney stopped. Counsel, the judge said, your client is fortunate that this hearing is civil rather than criminal. I'd leave this room quietly if I were advising him. The attorney sat down. Clara sat very still for a moment. The room around her had begun to shift. The low sound of people beginning to speak to each other, the particular hum of a crowd that has reached a verdict of its own. She felt Holt put a hand briefly on the table beside hers, a restrained gesture of acknowledgement, and she nodded. She looked across the room. Mabel Stott was holding Noah, who had successfully investigated the brooch and moved on to Mabel's hat. Ruth Parsley was talking to the woman beside her. Crane was standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression satisfied in a quiet way. Ethan was coming back from the front of the room toward her. He sat down. He didn't say anything. He looked at her and she looked at him, and in that look was the whole weight of the last 2 months. The snowstorm, the coffee in the morning, the letters on the table, the nights by the fire, the word "we" that had appeared in the room one afternoon and stayed. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. She got up and went to collect Noah from Mabel Stott, who surrendered him without complaint and said, Keep those letters, girl. Keep them somewhere fireproof. She said it with the authority of someone who has learned this particular lesson the hard way. I will, Clara said. She carried Noah out of the town hall and into the cold, bright air of the winter morning, and Noah blinked in the light and looked around at the world with his usual thoroughness, and Clara held him and breathed and let the last of the tension run out of her the way water runs out of cupped hands, slowly, completely, until there's nothing left but the shape of the holding. The drive back from town was quieter than the drive in. Not an uncomfortable quiet. It had none of the compressed tension of the morning, none of the particular silence that comes before something difficult. This was the quiet of two people who had just been through something and were still settling, the way a house settles after a hard wind has passed. The road ran straight west through the valley, the mountains catching the afternoon light in long, pale angles, and Clara sat with Noah in her lap and watched the landscape and felt very carefully like a person who had just set down something very heavy. Noah fell asleep before they were out of town. He did this sometimes after overstimulation. Just shut down, completely and suddenly, like a lamp turned low. He was warm against her, and his breathing was steady, and she held him with one arm and looked out at the road. He's out, Ethan said, glancing over. He always does this after too much happening. She shifted slightly to keep him comfortable. He'll sleep through supper if I let him. Let him, Ethan said. He earned it. She almost smiled. He didn't do anything. He sat through a 2-hour legal proceeding without crying. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. That's more than some grown men could manage. She did smile then, briefly, to herself. They were quiet again for a while. The horse moved at an easy pace, not rushed, and the wagon wheels made their familiar sound on the frozen ground, and Clara sat in it all and tried to locate exactly what she felt. The relief was real, but it was not simple. It did not feel like an ending so much as a door that had been standing locked for months and had finally been opened, and she was standing in the doorway looking at what was on the other side without being entirely certain what to do next. What happens now? She said. Not to Ethan specifically, not as a question that required his answer, just aloud. He was quiet for a moment. Briggs can appeal. Holt says the grounds are thin, but he can try. He won't, she said. She was sure of this in the way she'd become sure of a few things about Walter Briggs over the past months, not through affection or closeness, but through the particular knowledge of a person who has been studied by someone and learned to study them back. He wanted to win in that room because the room was full of people. He lost in front of everyone who matters to him in this valley. He won't go to a higher court and risk losing again in front of strangers. She looked at the road. He'll go quiet. He's good at going quiet. Ethan considered this. You're probably right. I'm right, she said, without heat. He glanced at her. Yeah, he said. You probably are. The ranch came into view ahead, the line of fence posts and the dark shapes of the barn and house against the pale winter light. Hitch came out to meet them when they pulled into the yard, tail going, deeply interested in the return of the wagon as he always was, as if each return were the first and therefore remarkable. Clara carried Noah inside without waking him. She put him down on the bed in the back room and stood over him for a moment, watching him breathe. He had Walter's coloring, as she couldn't help knowing that it was simply true. But everything else about him, every line of his face and every quality of his temperament, felt entirely his own. Serious. Thorough. Stubbornly present. She had no idea where those things came from, and she didn't need to know. They were his, and they were good. She went back to the kitchen. Ethan had put the kettle on and was standing at the window looking out at the yard. Thank you, she said. He turned. For today? For all of it. She sat down at the table. For the room, the first night. For Holt. For standing up in that courtroom. She paused. For not making it complicated. He looked at her steadily. Wasn't complicated. It was, though. For you. Your reputation. My reputation is fine, he said. He said it without defensiveness, just as a fact. Anyone who matters in this valley was in that room today. They saw what they saw. He turned back to the window. People respect what's clear. Takes them a while sometimes, but they get there. Clara wrapped her hands around the mug he'd set in front of her. The coffee was already brewed. He must have put it on before they'd left that morning, knowing they'd want it when they got back. That kind of thinking ahead. She had noticed it in him early, that habit of quiet provision, the way he anticipated what would be needed without making a production of it. She thought about the question that had been living in the back of her mind for weeks, the one she hadn't let herself ask directly because the timing had never been right, or because she'd been afraid of what asking might shift. The hearing was over. The immediate danger was past. The timing would never be any more right than it was now. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. What do you want this to be? She said. Going forward, I need to know what you're thinking. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, not surprised. He had the air of a man who had been thinking about this himself and had not found a comfortable way to start. I think, he said slowly, that you should stay. Not because you don't have options, not because of the boy or the hearing or because it's practical. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Because I want you here. And because I'm not certain, but I think that this has been working, the way things work when they're right, not when they're convenient. Clara looked at him. He was not smooth about it, she noticed. He looked slightly pained, the way honest people sometimes look when they're saying something they've been sitting on too long. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I know, neither am I. I keep the accounts better than you. I know that too. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. That's part of why I want you to stay. She looked down at her mug. She thought about the letters she'd written to Walter Briggs in September, the hope she'd folded up carefully and sent west with them. She thought about how she'd told herself not to want things, because wanting made the losses sharper. She thought about $11.40 and a train ticket and a boarding house in Concord and a life that had been very small for a very long time. She thought about this kitchen at dawn, the coffee already poured, the mountains in the window going pink. All right, she said. He looked at her. Not because it's practical, she said, because I want to. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man receiving something he'd hoped for and isn't going to make excessive noise about. He picked up his own mug. She picked up hers. Outside, Hitch was barking at something in the yard, probably a bird, which he always pretended was a significant threat. It was not a romantic moment. It was better than that. But the weeks after the hearing reshaped the valley in ways Clara hadn't quite anticipated. She had expected the verdict to change things incrementally. A few more people willing to say hello in town, a slight warming in the quality of interaction she'd already had. What she hadn't expected was the speed of it, the way a community that has been waiting for a thing to be decided can swing around once it is, as if the decision gives them permission to feel what some of them had been feeling all along. Ruth Parsley came to visit 4 days after the hearing. She brought a covered dish and the news that Edna Croft had stopped attending the sewing circle, which she delivered without comment in a tone that implied the two facts were related. She stayed for 2 hours and held Noah for most of it, and interrogated Clara on the subject of her plans with the thoroughness of a woman who has decided she has a stake in the outcome. "You're staying on, then," Ruth said. "I'm staying on," Clara said. "Good." Ruth handed Noah a spoon to investigate. "Ethan Callahan is rattled around in that house long enough. He needed something living in it." Clara wasn't sure she liked being described as something living, but she let it go. Ruth meant well, and beneath the bluntness was a genuine warmth that Clara had come to recognize and trust. Mabel Stott started offering Clara a discount at the store, which Clara refused twice before understanding that Mabel didn't experience it as charity, but as a form of alliance, and accepting it as such. The third time she came in, Mabel had a small package of peppermint candy waiting on the counter. "For the boy," Mabel said, "when he's old enough." "That might be a while," Clara said. "He's 8 months." "I'll keep it," Mabel said. "I've got time." Not everyone came around quickly. There were people in the valley who had done business with Walter Briggs for years and whose opinion of Clara remained cautious, watching. She did not expect otherwise. Trust was earned in daily increments, not granted in moments of drama, and she was content to work on it the way she worked on most things, steadily, without making it into more than it was. She heard about Walter Briggs secondhand, the way you hear about people in small places once they've been moved to the margin of things. He was at his ranch. He was managing. He had not appealed the ruling, as she had expected. He had stopped coming to town for the social events he used to attend, the card games and the evening gatherings at the saloon. Whether this was shame or strategy, she didn't know, and she made herself not spend energy on trying to figure it out. He was not her problem to solve or understand. He was simply a chapter she had survived. The hard part, the part that no court verdict addressed and no change in social standing could fix, was internal. Clara had known it would come, had known since the morning after the hearing, when she'd woken up feeling not triumphant but oddly deflated, the way you feel when something you've been bracing against for a long time is suddenly no longer there. The brace becomes the structure after a while. When it's gone, you have to figure out what you're actually made of underneath. She was, she discovered, somewhat more frightened than she'd realized. Not of Walter, not anymore. Not of the town or the gossip or the next thing that might go wrong. Something quieter than that. The fear that came from beginning to want something real, something that required her to stay in place and be known, after years of making herself small enough to not risk losing too much. She was good at leaving, in the sense that she'd become good at not attaching too firmly. The boarding house in Concord, the jobs that had come and gone. She had always known, somewhere under the surface, that the next thing could fall through and she needed to be ready for that. It was not a way of living that made you unhappy exactly. It made you careful. It made you very good at packing. Here there was nowhere to pack to. Here there was a kitchen she'd reorganized, an account she maintained, and a dog who had decided she was acceptable, and a man who said, "Come back with the sheriff," with the steady confidence of someone who has already worked out where he stands. Here there was a child who was hers in every way that counted, walking now, always walking, heading toward whatever was in front of him with the methodical determination that was entirely his own character. She was not ready to leave any of it. That was the frightening thing. She was not ready. And not ready was different from the careful not attaching she'd practiced for years. Not ready meant she'd already let it matter. She told Ethan some of this one evening, not all of it, not the parts that were still being formed, but enough. She was not a person who disclosed easily, she'd disclosed to Walter and look how that had ended, but Ethan was not Walter, and the comparison felt important to keep making to herself until it stopped feeling necessary. She said, "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." He said, "Something will." She looked at him. "It always does," he said. "Roof needs fixing in spring. One of the cattle's been coughing. I'm watching her. Last year the creek flooded the south pasture and we lost 2 weeks of grazing." He looked at his hands. "Things go wrong. You deal with them. That's the whole of it." She stared at him. "That's supposed to be reassuring?" "I'm not trying to reassure you. I'm telling you what's true." He met her eyes. "You've been waiting for something to go wrong since the day I found you in that cabin. You've been ready to leave every morning since you got here. I've watched you do it. Keep one foot lighter than the other." He said it without accusation. "I can't tell you it won't get hard. It will. I can tell you that you don't have to stand in the doorway anymore." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to not do that," she said. "I know." He picked up his book. "But you've stopped packing the bag in your head every time Briggs sent a letter. You stopped doing that about 3 weeks ago." She thought about it. He was right. She hadn't noticed when it stopped. "You've been watching me," she said. "It's my house," he said. Hard not to notice things. She picked up the mending she'd set down. They sat by the fire the way they did most evenings, reading or working, not talking unless something needed saying. And the fire settled down into coals and the house made its quiet sounds around them. And it was unremarkable and ordinary, and it was, Clara thought, the closest she had felt to something she'd stopped letting herself call home in a very long time. Spring took its time about arriving. February was hard. 2 weeks of cold that deepened rather than easing, a late storm that dropped 2 feet of snow and kept them inside for 3 days straight, which tested them in small and human ways. Ethan was not easy when he couldn't get outside. He became restless in a low-grade way, not irritable exactly, but compressed, as if the walls were closer than he preferred. Clara, who had spent years in small spaces out of necessity, did not have the same problem, but she found that she was tightly organized about the domestic space in ways that required negotiation. He left things where he was done with them, rather than where they went. She moved them. He moved them back without realizing it. They had 3 minor disagreements about the placement of objects in the kitchen that were not really about the objects, and 1 conversation about habits that was slightly too direct for comfort, and left them both quiet for an afternoon before they came back to it and finished it properly. The 3 days of storm also produced this. On the second evening, with the wind loud outside and Noah sleeping early from the cold, Ethan told her about his wife. He hadn't done it deliberately, or if he had, it was in the way of a decision made without ceremony, just, it was time. Her name had been Margaret. He talked about her for an hour, unhurried, the way you talk about someone you've been carrying quietly for a long time and have finally found a place to set down. He said she'd been quick in a way that could be sharp when she was tired. He said she disliked horses but learned to tolerate them for his sake. He said the house felt like a different building the week she died in it, and that this particular quality had never entirely left. Clara listened without offering comfort, because she could tell he wasn't looking for comfort. He was just telling her. The difference mattered. When he was done, she said, "She sounds like she was interesting." "She was," he said. "She was difficult and funny and better than me at most things and not much good at others, and she was here." He looked at the fire. "That's what I miss, the specific shape of someone in a place." Clara understood that. She had missed it before she'd had it, had missed the possibility of it, the idea of someone who knew which floorboards creaked and which side of the bed you slept on, and what your face looked like when you were trying not to show that something was wrong. She said, "I'm here." He looked at her. "I know," he said. He yawned. March came and the snow began to yield at the edges, reluctantly, the way winter always gave ground in this part of the country, not all at once but in daily retreats, a little mud showing beneath the snow along the south fence, then the creek running louder, then the cattle moving with more purpose in the pasture, scenting something changing in the air. Noah found mud. The discovery happened on a morning when Clara had turned her back for what felt like 30 seconds, and turned back to find him sitting in the yard in the first real mud of the season, both hands deep in it, examining it with the methodical interest he brought to all new materials. He looked up at her with an expression of pure scientific engagement. "No," she said. He looked at the mud. He looked at her. He put another handful of mud on his leg. "Noah!" He offered her some mud. A gift. She was still trying to decide how to respond to this when she heard Ethan come out of the barn. He stopped, took in the scene, and said nothing for a moment. He found it, Clara said. He did, Ethan agreed. He looked at Noah with the expression she had come to know well, the careful, peripheral attention that had been getting less peripheral for months. Less and less pretense of being about something else. Just looking at the boy directly now, with the calm recognition of someone who has stopped fighting a conclusion. Noah held up both mud-covered hands toward Ethan. Ethan crouched down. He was a tall man, and he folded himself down to Noah's level in the particular way he'd developed over the past months, the unhurried drop to meet a small person at their own height. He looked at the offered hands. "That's good mud," he said seriously. Noah agreed, apparently because he put one muddy hand directly on Ethan's knee. "That's going to need washing," Clara observed. "I know," Ethan said, not moving. She watched them in the thin early spring light, the man crouched in the mud and the boy sitting in it, regarding each other with mutual seriousness. And something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for months, for years, for longer than she could trace. Not a resolution, not an ending. A beginning of a different kind than the one she'd packed a trunk and traveled 11 days for, the one she'd been promised and had believed. This one had not been promised. This one had happened the way the good things sometimes happen, sideways, while she was trying to survive something else, in the gap between what she'd planned and what she'd gotten. Later, with Noah cleaned up and eating in the kitchen, Ethan came in and poured coffee and sat across from her and said, without preamble, "I'd like to marry you, if you're willing." Clara looked up from the account she'd been working on. He was looking at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable honesty that she had come to understand was what he looked like when he was saying something that mattered to him. No performance, no speech, just the plain thing, offered plainly. "Not because of how things look," he said. "Not for the practical reasons, though those exist. Because I want to. Because this is—" He stopped, tried again. "Because I'd like for it to be clear what this is." Clara set down her pen. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had driven into a snowstorm for reasons he couldn't fully explain and had not once, in the months since, made her feel like she owed him for it. This man who had stood at a gate and said, "Get out," and meant it, who had gone into a courtroom and told the plain truth without drama or elaboration, who left the coffee ready in the morning and did not explain why. "All right," she said. He blinked. "That's it? You didn't give me a speech. I don't make speeches." "Then I don't need one." She picked her pen back up. "I said all right." He sat there for a moment, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not quite disbelief, not quite relief. Something that was gathering itself into a shape that would probably, eventually, be happiness, though it wasn't going to get there in a hurry. That was fine. She was not in a hurry either. Noah banged his spoon on the table. They both looked at him. He banged it again with great satisfaction, apparently pleased with the sound. "He agrees," Ethan said. "He agrees with everything that makes noise," Clara said. They married in April, when the mud had dried out enough to make the drive to town reasonable. It was not a large occasion. Ruth Parsley came, and Mabel Stott, and Sheriff Crane, who shook Ethan's hand and said something quietly in his ear that made Ethan nod once, and Holt sent a letter from Laramie that arrived 2 days before and contained, among other things, a dry joke about billing for emotional support. Noah wore the outfit Clara had sewn for him in February, during the snowstorm days, which he had almost outgrown but still fit well enough if she didn't try to button the top. He was deposited with Mabel Stott for the duration of the ceremony and spent the time investigating her brooch again with the persistence of someone who has unfinished business. The ceremony was short. The judge who performed it was not alderman but a younger man who did these things routinely and did not make too much of them, which suited both Clara and Ethan. There were words said that were the legal words, and then there were a few other words that were theirs, and then it was done. Outside, in the thin April sunlight, Ruth Parsley hugged Clara with the efficiency of a woman who has decided to be warmly disposed toward someone and intends to be thorough about it. Clara, who had not been hugged in months, stood in it and let it happen. "Good," Ruth said, which was apparently all the wedding commentary she felt was needed. They drove back in the afternoon with Noah asleep again across both their laps, his head on Clara's knee and his feet in Ethan's direction, and the mountains were clear in the last of the winter light and the first of the spring of it, That particular quality of late afternoon western sky that was not beautiful in any gentle way, but in a vast, indifferent, overwhelming way that made you feel both very small and strangely equal to things. "You all right?" Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. "You?" "Yeah." They drove on. The horse knew the way home. Walter Briggs left the valley in May. She heard it from Mabel, who heard it from the man who bought his property. Not all of it, just the house and the near pastures, the rest going back to the bank on the notes that had apparently finally come due. He sold what he could, settled what he was made to settle, and left without telling anyone where he was going, which was consistent with how he'd done most things. Clara received this information and sat with it for a day, examining her own reaction. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel sorry. She felt, mostly, the neutral recognition of a chapter having found its end without her having to be present for the closing of it. That was enough. More than enough, actually. Some endings didn't need to be witnessed to be real. She went out to the south pasture that afternoon, where Ethan was working on the fence the winter had damaged. Noah was strapped to her back in a carrier she'd fashioned, watching the world over her shoulder with great interest, as he always did from that height. She told Ethan about Walter. He straightened up from the fence post and looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she trusted him with true things now, "Mostly just tired of having thought about him as much as I have. I'd like to stop." He turned back to the fence post. "Then stop," he said. "Nothing's making you keep at it." She stood in the spring sun with Noah on her back and the smell of mud and new grass coming off the pasture and thought, "Yes, nothing is making me keep at it." She stayed in the pasture for a while, watching Ethan work. He was not graceful at it. He was competent and strong, but he moved with the practical economy of someone doing necessary work rather than performing anything. He grunted at one point when a post was harder than expected. He muttered something under his breath that she was fairly certain was a word she didn't allow in front of Noah. "Language," she said. He glanced at her. "He's 8 months old." 9 months, and they hear everything. Ethan looked at Noah over her shoulder. Noah looked back at him. "Sorry," Ethan said to the baby. Noah held out one hand in the gesture he still used for acknowledgement. Ethan shook it, very solemnly. Clara watched this and felt the specific, undramatizable thing she had learned did not announce itself with trumpets or come with language equal to it. The unnameable weight of ordinary days that had become, without her quite noticing when, the thing she was building her life on. She had come west looking for a home. She had found one, though not where she'd been told to look, and not by the road she'd planned to take, and nothing about it looked like what she'd pictured. The house was real. The man was complicated and quiet and made the coffee in the morning without being asked. The child was hers and growing and had recently learned to say something that was either more or ma with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. She was not a woman who had been saved. She was a woman who had survived a thing and then built something on the far side of surviving it, and the building was still going on, would go on, would keep requiring work and patience and the willingness to still be there when the fence post gave out and the creek flooded and the winter came back, as winter always did and stayed longer than you wanted it to. But the winter had already shown her what it could do, and she was still here. That, she thought, was the whole of what she needed to know. The summer that followed their marriage was not easy, and Clara would not have wanted it to be. Easy would have meant something was being smoothed over, managed, kept at a careful distance. What happened instead was the harder and more genuine thing. Two people who had each spent years building walls around the parts of themselves that had been damaged. Learning, slowly and imperfectly, to let the walls be a little lower. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most real things happen, in the middle of ordinary moments, when neither of them was prepared for it. The first real argument came in June, over money. Ethan had made a decision about the south pasture, a drainage project that would cost more than they had liquid, requiring him to draw against the reserve account, without consulting Clara. Not out of malice, not out of any intention to exclude her. Simply out of habit, the deeply grooved habit of a man who had made every financial decision on this ranch alone for 7 years, and had forgotten, in the way of habits that the habit existed. Clara found out from the invoice that arrived, which she opened because she handled the mail now, because she handled the accounts, because that was the arrangement they had worked out over months, and that she had believed was understood to include decisions that affected those accounts. She was very calm when she brought it to him. That was how she got when she was genuinely angry. Not louder, but quieter, more precise. "You should have told me," she said. "It needed doing," he said. "The south pasture's been draining wrong for 3 seasons. Another wet spring and we lose the whole south run. I'm not arguing about the pasture. I'm saying you should have told me." She set the invoice on the table between them. "We agreed on how the money works. You went around it." He looked at the invoice. She watched his jaw tighten in the specific way that meant he knew she was right and was deciding how to sit with that. "I didn't think about it," he said. "I know you didn't. That's the problem." A silence. Not comfortable. The kind that has edges. "I'll tell you next time," he said. "Before, not after." "Before," he agreed. It was not an eloquent resolution. There was no long conversation about what it meant, no careful unpacking of his 7 years of solitary decision-making and her years of having no decisions to make. They were not that kind of people. But it settled something, because the alternative, her saying nothing, filing it away, letting the resentment build beneath the surface the way water builds beneath ice, was the thing that actually destroyed arrangements like this one, and they both understood that even if they didn't say it plainly. The drainage project was done by August. The south pasture drained correctly. Ethan showed her the difference, walking the fence line with her one evening and pointing out the new channels, explaining what had been wrong and how it had been fixed. She asked technical questions, and he answered them, and by the end of the walk she understood the pasture better than she had before, and he had explained it in a way that suggested he was glad she'd asked. "Next spring it'll hold," he said. "Good," she said, "since we paid for it." He glanced at her. She kept her face straight for a moment, then didn't. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. "You're going to bring that up for a while." "Probably," she said. "It's a useful reference point." Turso. Noah learned to talk that summer in earnest, the way children do when language suddenly makes sense to them as a system rather than a collection of isolated sounds. He had been saying ma and more for months. Now words arrived in quick succession. Dog, which came out as daw, and applied to Hitch specifically, and all other animals generally. Out, which he said constantly and emphatically, because outside was where he wanted to be at all times. And a word that Clara heard first one morning in July and stood very still when she heard it. Ethan was coming in from the barn. Noah was at the window watching him cross the yard. He put both hands on the glass and said clearly, with the tone of someone reporting a known fact, "Da." Clara was behind him. She didn't move. Ethan came through the door and stopped when he saw Noah at the window with his hands against the glass, and Noah turned and pointed at him and said it again. "Da." Ethan stood in the doorway. His expression went through several things very quickly. Surprise. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that had no clean name and didn't need one. He crossed the room and crouched down to Noah's level. "Hey," he said in the low, even voice he used with the boy when it was just the two of them, and he didn't know Clara was listening. Noah grabbed the front of his shirt. "Da," he said again, with the satisfaction of someone who has named a thing correctly. "Yeah," Ethan said, quietly. "Yeah, okay." Clara turned back to the kitchen. She did not make a production of it. She started on breakfast and listened to the sound of Ethan talking to Noah in the main room, low and unhurried. The particular tone of a man who has been surprised into tenderness and decided to just stay in it rather than back away. She had not planned for this to be what it was. She had planned, back in September, for a practical arrangement, for a working partnership, for a home in the functional sense. She had not planned for Ethan Callahan, who was difficult and deliberate and said true things in flat voices and had gone out in a snowstorm for reasons he still had not fully explained, and had become, without either of them designing it, the person her son called for when he was in the other room and wanted someone. She cracked an egg and thought, this is the thing that matters. Not the court, not the verdict, not Walter leaving the valley. This ordinary morning, Summer passed into fall with the particular efficiency of frontier seasons, which did not linger. The cattle needed moving, the hay needed storing. There were fence repairs that had waited since spring and could not wait any longer. Clara helped where she was useful and learned where she wasn't and asked questions without embarrassment, because she had long since decided that the only sensible attitude toward ignorance was to correct it. She learned to read the cattle with more accuracy. She learned which of the horses had what temperament. She learned the rhythms of the ranch in all 4 seasons now, having arrived in winter and moved through spring and summer and felt fall coming in the quality of the light, the morning chill that arrived earlier each week, the smell of the air that she had started to recognize as this specific place, this specific land, hers now in the way that only accumulated daily experience can make a place yours. Noah walked everywhere and into everything. He had no concept of a hazard he couldn't investigate, which meant someone was watching him at nearly all times, which the 3 adults present, herself, Ethan, and the frequent presence of Ruth Parsley, who had appointed herself a kind of honorary family member, managed in rotation. Hitch had resigned himself entirely to his role as Noah's primary mobile obstacle course. The dog bore this with the dignity of an old soldier. In September, a letter came from Clara's sister in Concord. Her name was Jane, and they had corresponded through all of this. Clara had written to her through the Walter situation, through the hearing, through the marriage. But Jane's letters had been careful in a way that Clara had understood meant Jane wasn't certain what to think, and was being diplomatic about her uncertainty. Jane had been the practical one in the family, the one who calculated odds, who worried. This letter was different. Jane wrote that she had been reading Clara's letters to her husband, and that her husband had said after the letter about the hearing that the woman sounded like she'd finally landed somewhere solid. Jane wrote that she was relieved in a way she hadn't known how to say before, because she had been frightened when Clara left for Wyoming, more frightened than she'd admitted. She wrote that she wanted, if it was all right, to come visit in the spring, to see where Clara was, to see Noah. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and set it in the wooden box where she kept things she wanted to keep. She told Ethan that evening. He listened and said, "She can stay in the back room. We'll put Noah in with us while she's here." That was all he said about it. That was all that needed saying. She wrote back to Jane that night. "Come in April, when the mud is cleared. The house isn't large, but we'll make room. There's a lot I want to show you." She meant the pasture and the mountains and the kitchen she'd organized and the dog and the particular quality of the winter light over the valley that she'd been trying to describe in letters for months without getting it right. She meant all of it. She meant, "I live here. I actually live here, in a way I haven't lived anywhere before. Come see." The first snow of the season came in early November, which Ethan said was normal, and Clara, who had now lived through one full cycle of this valley's weather, was prepared for. She watched it come from the kitchen window in the morning, not the sideways aggressive snow of that first night, but a quiet vertical snow, settling evenly over the yard and the fence posts and the barn roof. Noah stood beside her at the window and watched it with complete concentration. "No," he said, pointing at it. "Snow," she said. He considered this information. "No," he said again, more firmly, as if lodging an objection. "It doesn't care what you think about it." He looked at her, then back at the snow, then put his hand against the cold glass the way he had when he'd first spotted Ethan in the yard, and said "da" for the first time. The gesture of a boy taking ownership of what he sees, claiming it with his palm. She thought about the first time he'd seen snow. He'd been 6 months old, and it had been trying to kill them both. He didn't remember it. He would never remember it. The cabin, the cold, the floor against her back, the particular silence of waiting in the dark for something to change. She would remember it for both of them, carry it the way parents carry the things their children were too young to know they survived. That was a strange thing about motherhood, she had come to understand. You held not only the child, but all the versions of them that had existed before they could hold themselves. The cold baby in the cabin and the mud-covered baby in the yard and the boy at the window objecting to winter were all the same person, and she was the through line, the one who'd been present for all of it, the one who would keep the record. Ethan came in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots. He looked at Noah at the window. "He's seen his second snow," he said. "He objects to it," Clara said. Ethan crouched beside Noah at the window. "You'll get used to it," he told the boy. Noah looked at him. "No," he said, pointing at the snow. "Yeah," Ethan said. "No stopping it, though." He stood back up and poured coffee and brought her a cup without asking, the way he always did, the morning habit that had become so regular she'd stopped noticing it until she thought about it, at which point it seemed like one of those things so woven into the day that its absence would rearrange everything. She took the cup. She looked at the snow coming down, quiet and steady and indifferent. She thought about the letter she'd gotten from Holt in October, a brief professional note saying that Walter Briggs's attorney had formally closed the case, no further action. She thought about the accounts, which were better than they'd been in the fall because the summer grazing had gone well, and she'd found an error in the grain supplier's billing that had saved them more than she'd expected. She thought about Noah saying "da" in July, and Ethan's face doing the thing it had done that she still didn't have a word for, but had stopped needing one. She thought about the woman who had stood on the edge of a tree line in the snow and watched a wagon drive away. 24 years old, 1,100 miles from anything she knew, holding a 6-month-old boy, and her own frozen certainty that she had been brought here to be used and then discarded. That woman was still her. She had not stopped being that woman, did not believe in the idea of leaving your past behind as though it were a coat you could take off. That night was in her, the cold of it, the silence, the particular quality of being left. It had made her watchful in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not. It had made her careful with trust. It had made her very good at packing, and then, slowly, over the course of one winter and one spring and one difficult and ordinary summer, it had made her willing to put the bag down. You couldn't unknow the things that had happened to you, but you could decide what you built on top of them. And she had built this, a kitchen that was hers in a house that was theirs. A child who walked in mud and objected to snow and called for the man in the yard when he heard his boots on the porch. An account book in her hand and letters in a wooden box, and a dog who had accepted her, and a neighbor who hugged her with the efficiency of someone who has decided to be family and intends to be thorough about it. It was not what she had planned. She had planned something smaller, something safer, something that asked less of her and therefore risked less. This asked more. It kept asking more. The fence broke and the creek flooded and the cattle needed watching and the winter came back as winter always did. And there would be more arguments about money or habits, or the particular ways that two people who had each been alone too long still surprised each other with their edges. But she was not standing in a doorway with one foot lighter than the other. She was here. Fully, plainly, irreversibly. Here. What? Spring came again, her second spring in the valley, with the same slow reluctance and the same eventual generosity. The mud came first, as it always did, and Noah's relationship with it had only deepened over winter. He went after it with the dedication of a researcher returning to a long-term project. Jane arrived in April, as planned, on the stage from Cheyenne. Clara drove out to meet her alone, leaving Noah with Ethan, and stood at the stage stop and watched her sister climb down and look around at the landscape with the wide-eyed expression of someone encountering a place that is larger than they'd imagined. Jane was smaller than Clara remembered, or perhaps Clara had just stopped thinking of herself as the smaller one. They stood and looked at each other for a moment. "You look different," Jane said. "Different how?" Jane considered. "Like you know where you are." Clara thought about that for a moment. It was an odd thing to say, and also exactly right. "Come on," she said. "It's an hour's drive, and I want you to see the mountains before the light changes." Jane looked west. The mountains were clear that afternoon, sharp-edged in the spring air, enormous in the way of things that don't care whether you're impressed by them. "Clara," Jane said. "I know," Clara said. "Come on." The drive back was nothing like the drive Clara had made with Walter Briggs 18 months ago, though it was on the same road, through the same landscape. Jane asked questions, and Clara answered them honestly, about the hearing, about Ethan, about the ranch, about the life they'd built. She didn't soften it, and she didn't dramatize it. She told it plain. Jane listened. Toward the end, she said, "I was scared for you, when you left Concord." "I know. I should have said so." "You should have," Clara agreed. "But I was scared too, and I wouldn't have listened." Jane was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is he good to you?" Clara thought about it in the honest way the question deserved, not the reflexive way. She thought about the coffee in the morning and the courtroom and the argument about the drainage invoice and the look on his face in July. "Yes," she said, "in the specific way that matters, not the easy way." Jane seemed to understand this. She looked out at the road ahead, at the valley opening up around them. When they came over the low rise and the ranch came into view, the house, the barn, the fence line she could map in her sleep now, Clara watched her sister see it. The real thing. Not the letter version of it. "It's real," Jane said. She sounded slightly surprised. "What did you think?" I don't know, I thought maybe you were making it sound better." "I wasn't making it sound like anything," Clara said. "I was just describing it." They pulled into the yard. Hitch came out to investigate, decided Jane was probably acceptable, and went back to his spot by the barn. Ethan came out of the house with Noah on his arm, Noah dressed in the coat that was slightly too big for him because Clara had bought it a size ahead so it would last, which he was currently using as a repository for a small collection of pebbles in the left pocket. Noah saw Clara and immediately reached for her. She took him. He said, "Ma," and then turned to look at Jane with his dark, serious eyes. Jane looked at him. Her expression did the thing that people's expressions did when they encountered Noah. The helpless softening, the particular response to a child who is looking at you with complete undivided attention as if you are the most interesting thing he has encountered all week. "Hello," Jane said. Noah considered her. He reached into his pocket, selected a pebble with care, and offered it to her. Jane took it. "Thank you," she said. Noah seemed satisfied. He settled against Clara's shoulder and looked around the yard as if confirming that everything was in its proper place. Ethan put out his hand to Jane. "Ethan Callahan," he said. "I know who you are," Jane said. She shook his hand and looked at him for a moment with the assessing expression of an older sister who has been worrying about someone and is now taking stock in person. Whatever she saw, she nodded once, brief and decisive. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll put water on." Well, Jane stayed 2 weeks. She was not easy company in the way that comfortable strangers are easy. She had opinions, and she shared them, and she and Clara disagreed twice, clearly and without lasting damage, which was how it had always been between them. She helped with the cooking and annoyed Hitch by rearranging his sleeping spot without understanding that he had a sleeping spot and that it mattered. She asked Ethan questions about the ranch that he answered with the patient thoroughness of a man who respected a direct question. And Clara watched them find their footing with each other and felt the particular satisfaction of people she cared about deciding they could tolerate one another. On her last evening, she and Clara sat on the porch after supper, the way they used to sit on the steps of the boarding house in Concord when the weather was good, close enough to hear each other without having to speak loudly. The valley was doing the thing it did some evenings in spring, the light going gold and then red, the mountains taking it in long, slow stages, the sky huge and still. "I used to worry," Jane said, "that you didn't want enough, that you'd talked yourself into being satisfied with less than you deserved." Clara looked at the mountains. "I probably had. And then I was scared the other direction, that what you wanted was too far away to be real. That might have been true too." Jane was quiet for a moment. What changed? Clara thought about it, not to perform the thinking, but because it was a genuine question that deserved a genuine answer. What had changed? A man drove his wagon back alone and left 2 people in the winter to find out what they were made of. A rancher went out in a snowstorm for reasons he'd have had trouble articulating. A baby held on to the first hand that came down to his level and didn't let go. An account book, a wooden box of letters, a kitchen reorganized, an argument about a drainage invoice that mattered because it was between 2 people who had agreed that things between them would be real. "I stopped waiting to find out if I was wanted," Clara said, "and started deciding what I was going to build." Jane turned to look at her. Clara met her eyes. "That's—" Jane stopped. She tried again. "That sounds lonelier." "It was," Clara said, "and then it wasn't." The evening light went on doing what it did, indifferent and magnificent, and they sat in it the way sisters sit when they've stopped needing to fill the silence and can just be in the same place at the same time, which is one of the rarer things and one of the better ones. Jane left on a Tuesday, and the house settled back into its rhythms, which were their rhythms now, hers and Ethan's and Noah's, the particular tempo of this specific life. Noah was walking with full confidence now, fast enough to require real attention, curious enough to make every room a project. He had recently learned that climbing was possible, which had opened new dimensions of potential catastrophe. He had also recently learned to say Ethan, which he rendered as E and used with great frequency, as if naming something made it more fully real. Ethan appeared to agree. He answered every time, without exception, no matter what he was doing. On a morning in late April, Clara was at the desk with the accounts when she heard Noah's voice in the yard and looked out the window. Ethan had taken him outside after breakfast, which he did most mornings now, just the two of them, an hour in the yard or the near pasture, Ethan doing whatever needed doing and Noah conducting his investigations at close range. She watched through the window. Ethan was at the fence near the paddock, checking a post that had shifted. Noah stood beside him, not playing, not wandering, just standing next to him, watching what he did with the focused interest he brought to everything. Ethan crouched down and said something, and Noah crouched too, in imperfect imitation, his balance not quite equal to the position, so that he sat down the last few inches rather than held it. He looked at the fence post. He put one small hand on it, the way Ethan's hand was on it, because that was what you did when you were learning something. You put your hand where the person who knew had their hand, and you tried to feel what they were feeling. Ethan showed him something about the post, the angle of it, the problem. Noah looked with complete seriousness. He nodded once, the nod of a person receiving information. Clara watched them and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic rescue, not the courtroom and the verdict. This. The morning and the fence post and the small hand placed next to the larger one. The daily, ordinary act of a man teaching a boy how to stand next to something that is broken and figure out how to fix it. Nobody had asked Ethan to be this. He had not been asked, and he had not announced it, and he had not made a ceremony of it. He had simply, over the course of one winter and one spring and one summer and one fall, become it. Become the person Noah ran to and called for and imitated. Become the presence that made the house feel inhabited in the way that Margaret had once made it feel inhabited, the specific warmth of another person's daily reality lived alongside yours. And Clara thought, this is what it costs, and this is what it gives back, and the math is not clean, and it is not even, and there is no guarantee on any of it. Ethan could have not gone out in that snowstorm. She could have taken the $11.40 east on the first available transport. Noah could have been a different kind of child, less open, less certain, less willing to extend one hand toward a stranger and wait to see what happened. But none of those things had occurred. What had occurred was this. A man had gone out in a storm and found two people in the cold and brought them home, and over time that act of basic human decency had grown into something neither of them had planned and both of them had chosen, every day, in the incremental way that real choices work. Not once, not in a single dramatic moment, but over and over in the ordinary texture of getting up and making the coffee and telling the truth about the invoice and saying, all right, when the other person asked for something real. She had been thrown away. She knew what that felt like, had felt it standing in the snow with Walter's wagon disappearing around the bend, the cold specific knowledge of having been weighed and found insufficient. She did not believe that experience had made her stronger in the way people like to say, as though suffering were a kind of exercise with guaranteed results. It had made her harder in some ways and more watchful and slower to trust. It had cost her things she hadn't gotten back. But it had also brought her here, to this window, watching her son learn how to stand next to a fence post, and that was not a lesson she would have chosen or a route she would have designed. It was simply the route that existed, the one that had been in front of her on a Wednesday in November when she had packed a bag and gotten on a horse and ended up on the floor of an abandoned cabin holding on to the only thing she was certain of. She had held on. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. She turned back to the accounts. She found the number she'd been looking for, entered it in the correct column, and moved on to the next figure. Outside, she could hear Noah's voice and then Ethan's, low and patient, and then Noah's again asking something with the insistence of a child who has been told how things work and needs to verify it personally. The morning went on. The valley held its shape around the ranch, the mountains to the west, the long grass pastures to the south. The creek she could hear in spring flood now, doing what it did every year, rising and then settling, taking up more space than it was supposed to, and then returning to its banks because that, in the end, was what everything did. Rose and settled, went farther than expected, and came back to where it belonged. She finished the accounts by mid-morning and went outside. Noah was trying to explain the fence post to Hitch, who was listening with the expression of a dog who has accepted that humans will say things at him and has made peace with not understanding most of it. Ethan was at the other end of the fence, checking the gate. Clara walked out into the spring sun, into the smell of grass and mud and the faint sweetness of something blooming near the east fence that she hadn't identified yet. Noah saw her. "Ma," he said, with the same tone he'd been using since the beginning. Simple, declarative, the naming of something known. He held up a stick he'd found. She took the stick because this was what you did. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his conversation with Hitch. Ethan came along the fence line and stopped beside her. He looked at Noah and the dog and the mud and the morning. "Gate's solid," he said. "Good," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. 20 months ago, she had been on the floor of a cold cabin, not knowing if she would be alive by morning. She was here. He was here. The boy who nobody wanted was telling a dog about a stick with the authority of someone who has important information to convey. There was nothing to say about any of it that the morning wasn't already saying. She handed him the stick Noah had given her because she thought he should have it, and he took it without asking why, and that too was what it looked like.